WTF just happened to the housing market? Marcus refreshed the same listing 4 times in one evening, a house that had been sitting for 3 weeks with no offers, watching the price tick down by $10,000 while his group chat kept sending him headlines that said the opposite. Prices are still rising. Don't wait. You'll never catch a better window. Both things were technically true at the same time, in different corners of the same national market, which is exactly why this conversation gets so confusing so quickly. This video is about what's actually happening to housing right now, not the version built for a headline, the version built from the actual data. My name is Emory, and if you felt like every housing headline this year contradicts the one before it, prices crashing in one article and setting records in another, then this video should help sort out what's genuinely happening versus what's just noise. And if that's useful to you, sticking around and subscribing helps this channel keep breaking down confusing financial moments as they happen, calmly and without the panic. Most people think the housing market is either crashing or booming, one dramatic story playing out everywhere at once. They're completely wrong, and the reason matters because what's actually happening in mid-2026 isn't one national story at all. It's several regional stories happening simultaneously, and confusing them for a single trend is exactly what's producing the whiplash headlines everyone's been seeing. Here's the actual data. As of mid-2026, the median existing home price sits around $429,000, up roughly 1% year over year, while forecasters expect modest price growth for the rest of the year, somewhere between roughly 0.5% and 4%, alongside mortgage rates settling into the mid-6% range. That's not a crash. It's also not a boom. Most economists tracking this data are describing 2026 as something more specific. A rebalancing year, a market slowly finding a new equilibrium after several unusual years in a row. Someone might reasonably ask why so many people feel like a crash is already happening, if the national numbers describe something closer to stability. It's a fair question, and the honest answer lies in a detail easy to miss. In one major market like Houston, June sales were actually up 2% year over year, with prices holding flat and inventory at its highest level in years, a combination signaling more balance rather than distress. Meanwhile, other data sources are tracking something that sounds contradictory. Median list prices have been declining year over year for 8 consecutive months, even as broader home value indexes are still showing modest annual gains. Both of these can be true at once because they are measuring different things. List prices reflect what sellers are currently asking, while home value indexes reflect what's actually closing, and the gap between those two numbers is itself a signal about how negotiable this market has become. Here's where this gets genuinely interesting, because the geography matters more than the national headline suggests. Inventory has stayed relatively flat nationally over the past year, but new listings have actually decreased across the South and West, while inventory growth has concentrated specifically in more affordable Midwestern markets. This means someone shopping in a Midwestern city right now is genuinely experiencing a buyer-friendly market with real negotiating leverage, while someone shopping in parts of the South or West is experiencing something closer to the opposite, tighter supply and less room to negotiate, all under the same national headline. Someone might reasonably ask what's driving this specific pattern, since inventory shifting unevenly by region isn't the most intuitive outcome. Part of the answer connects to mortgage rates and what's often called the lock-in effect. A large share of homeowners refinanced or bought at rates well below where mortgages sit today, and moving means trading that older, lower rate for a new one, which discourages selling even when someone might otherwise want to move. This effect isn't uniform across the country. It tends to matter more in expensive coastal markets where the rate gap represents a larger dollar difference, which helps explain why listings have thinned out more sharply in some regions than others. There's a second, deeper story running underneath all of this, and it's the one that actually explains why so many people feel locked out regardless of what the monthly headlines say. The affordability gap between home prices and income has been widening for years, not months. Home prices have risen roughly 50% since 2020, while incomes over that same stretch have grown closer to 29%, a gap of more than 20 percentage points that sits underneath every other statistic in this conversation. This is the structural backdrop that makes even a modest, well-behaved rebalancing year still feel painful for a huge share of buyers, because the starting point going into 2026 was already historically stretched. The data on exactly how stretched is worth walking through directly. In the first quarter of 2026, a family earning the nation's median income needed roughly 32% of that income just to cover the mortgage payment on a median-priced home, a share that's actually improved slightly from 36% a year earlier, but still sits well above what's traditionally considered a comfortable, sustainable share. For lower-income families, defined as those earning about half the median, that same mortgage payment would require roughly 65% of their entire income, a number that makes homeownership functionally inaccessible regardless of what mortgage rates do next. This is the part of the housing conversation that rarely makes it into a headline, because affordability improved slightly, but remains historically severe, doesn't compress into a punchy title the way prices crashing or prices soaring does. Someone might reasonably ask what's actually behind this persistent affordability gap, since mortgage rates alone don't fully explain it. A meaningful part of the answer is structural supply, not temporary market sentiment. Industry estimates place the national housing shortage somewhere in the range of 1 to nearly 5 million units below what current demand actually requires, depending on the specific methodology used, and builders have been pulling back rather than closing that gap, partly due to labor shortages in construction, and partly due to rising material and financing costs of their own. This connects directly back to the construction job losses mentioned earlier, fewer construction workers building fewer homes, which means the supply side of this equation isn't correcting quickly, regardless of what demand does in any given month. There's also a cost that's crept into this conversation more recently and deserves its own explanation: insurance. In certain high-risk regions, particularly areas facing elevated wildfire, flood, or severe storm risk, insurance premiums have risen sharply enough to add hundreds of dollars to a monthly housing payment, or in some cases, to make a specific property difficult to insure at any reasonable price at all. This is a genuinely new dynamic compared to previous housing cycles, where insurance was rarely a deciding factor in affordability, and it's now become significant enough that it's reshaping which regions feel affordable independent of what's happening with home prices or mortgage rates themselves. Here's the part worth sitting with honestly rather than resolving into a simple prediction. Nearly 40% of both buyers and sellers surveyed recently said they're personally concerned about a housing crash this year, even though the underlying data doesn't currently support that outcome. This gap between sentiment and data is itself a meaningful part of the story, because widespread anxiety about a crash, even an anxiety not supported by current numbers, can genuinely affect behavior. Sellers holding off, buyers waiting on the sidelines, both responses that can further distort a market that was otherwise moving toward balance. Someone might reasonably ask what this all means practically, for someone actually trying to make a decision right now rather than simply understand the headlines. For a prospective buyer, the honest takeaway is that waiting for a dramatic crash isn't well supported by current data, since most forecasts point toward continued modest movement rather than a sharp correction. But that doesn't mean timing is irrelevant either, since regional conditions vary enough that the same national moment can mean genuinely different things depending on where someone is actually shopping. For a current homeowner considering selling, the lock-in effect is worth taking seriously as a real financial calculation, not just an emotional attachment to a lower rate, since trading a sub-4% mortgage for something in the mid-sixes has a concrete, calculable monthly cost that deserves to be weighed deliberately rather than avoided out of habit. And for renters watching this entire conversation from the sidelines, the affordability data suggests the pressure pushing people toward renting longer isn't a temporary blip. It's a structural pattern likely to persist until supply and income growth close more of that 20-point gap, which historically takes years rather than months. If the actual question is what just happened to the housing market, the honest answer isn't a single event or a single direction. It's a market splitting unevenly by region, cooling in some places while staying tight in others, moving toward balance nationally while feeling like crisis or opportunity, depending entirely on which specific market someone happens to be watching, all sitting on top of a longer-running affordability gap between prices and income that the math doesn't support a national crash narrative right now, and it doesn't support a return to the frenzy of a few years ago either. It simply describes a market slowly rebalancing, unevenly, the way real markets usually do rather than the way headlines describe them.